Hey, it's good to see you. Take a seat, get comfortable, and when you're ready, I'd like to look at some images together and discuss the feelings they might or might not evoke in you. For example, how does this image make you feel? What about this one? What about this one? Sorry, I'm not trying to put you on the spot. How about I go first? These images make me feel a combination of eeriness and intense nostalgia, like a really good ghost story, or like I left something important in the other room, but I can't remember what it was. I look at these images and I feel simultaneously both a longing to inhabit the spaces captured in them and also a gratitude that I can't. Thankful that I'm currently in my home, safe, surrounded by my familiar objects. The TikTok kids are calling these liminal space images, and there's a tendency to assume their appeal is universal, but I want to be careful with that because these images don't affect everyone the same way. A woman born in the former Soviet Union in 1958, for example, would probably not feel the same combination of eeriness and longing that I do when I look at this Pepsi machine in a lonely hotel hallway, but she might feel something similar if she looks at an image like this, or like this, or like this. What we call liminal space images on the Anglophone internet are really images of 80s, 90s, and aughts suburban American infrastructure. Hotels, offices, malls, restaurants, stores, schools, gyms, playgrounds. They all feel so familiar to us because statistically, most of the people who watch my videos, most of my audience lives in suburban America. Most Americans live in suburban America. I look at these images and see reflections of my own childhood taken out of the context in which I experienced them. The spaces captured in these images are a lot like, sometimes identical to the ones that house the happenings of my childhood, but those spaces were never really designed to be viewed on their own sans inhabitants. They were always meant to be backgrounded. They're spaces that are familiar to me but have simultaneously been radically decontextualized. There's nothing remarkable about these spaces except the choice to capture them on camera in the first place without the thing that makes them matter, the people for who the spaces are designed. In fact, what makes these images eerie is the very artistic choice of the photographer to see what is not meant to be seen in its own right, to force the background to be the subject. But there's something else going on too. Look at these images here. So these are sitcom sets, and even though they meet the criteria I just described, they're places designed to be backgrounded, you shouldn't be seeing them without actors inhabiting them, they aren't eerie to me in the same way. And that's probably because their design was overseen by art directors who were trying to communicate a sitcom tone quickly and efficiently so that if you're surfing the channels and you land on their show, you can pick up on all the visual cues and immediately understand that you're watching a sitcom. And that's accomplished with warm light and bright colors and varied textures and framed wall art and interesting knickknacks, usually all arranged around a central focal point. But despite their ostensibly suburban settings, these sitcom homes are, dare I say, obviously not representative of typical suburban life. And that's immediately obvious to everybody because the very objects that decorate them, the same cues you use to understand you're watching a sitcom in the first place, are simultaneously indicators that these fictional sitcom families are much wealthier than the average suburbanite. I know that because most Americans are suburbanites. If you're like me and you grew up watching sitcoms like this, you immediately recognize the imagery, but you recognize it from your memories watching TV, not from your life. Because if you grew up in the suburbs and you're anything like me, chances are your childhood home looked a lot less like a sitcom set and a lot more like a liminal space image. There's this chasm between the average American suburban experience and what pop culture tells us American suburbs are. When a piece of media is trying to romanticize the suburbs, it tells us that what we see on sitcom sets is the default setting of American reality. And when media aims to criticize the suburbs, it tells us that only wasps live there and all they do is go to country clubs and play golf. Pop culture tells us a suburban home should be full of high-quality furniture and decorated with framed art prints, maybe even original paintings. It should be lit by floor lamps and have tasteful window treatments. It should appear full but never cluttered, lived in but never messy. For decades, pop culture has been setting the expectation for what an American suburban home looks like, but it's never reflected reality, it's reflected aspiration. Looking at these liminal space images again after looking at all those sitcom sets, the liminal space images take on a new meaning. They expose the invisible infrastructures that we're not meant to be paying close attention to, but nevertheless serve as the foundation of our daily reality. Sitcom sets are the canny, the superimposed ideal, and the liminal space images represent the uncanny, the upside down, the subliminal reality finally manifesting itself, coming forth to be known. Suburbs with a lowercase s have always existed, or they've existed for as long as civilization has existed. Ancient Rome had suburbs, usually containing the sorts of people and things wealthy Romans didn't want to see, hear, or smell. Ancient Roman suburbs were home to tanneries and brickmakers, for example, because those things stunk, literally. And ancient Roman suburbs were also home to the sorts of people wealthy Romans didn't want to interact with. Sex workers, lepers, ethnic minorities. Suburbs literally means below the city in Latin. Even American suburbs are actually technically extremely old. Near modern-day St. Louis, archaeologists recently found the remains of a suburb of Cahokia, which was one of the largest pre-Columbian American cities. But when we're talking about American suburbs in 2026, we're usually talking about the post-World War II kind of suburb. You know, parking lots, strip malls, detached single-family homes. And it's this kind of suburb that we've developed these associations around. The types of people we think about living in the suburbs, what they look like, where they work, how they spend their free time. Those associations we currently have are a complete inversion of what suburbs have been used for basically all of human history. And that inversion has happened within the last 100 years. But the seeds were planted earlier than that. Thomas Jefferson had a vision of a nation built of independent farmers who all owned their own land. And that was a reaction against the long legacy of English land tenure. You've seen Downton Abbey, right? There were these great English pastoral entails helmed by lords, landlords, who owned the land their tenants farmed. Well, that's not quite right. The king owned all that land. Think of it as a pyramid scheme with him on top, and his vassals each held parcels of land at the pleasure of the king. And the vast majority of people were at the bottom of that pyramid, working that land, not for their own profit, but in exchange for some semblance of protection from their lord. In theory. But ultimately, you know, it's kind of up to each individual lord to decide how much protection he feels like offering. So it behooves the tenant farmer to be nice and agree with his lord about stuff. And so the American founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson specifically, worried that if non-landowning white men had the right to vote, that they would just vote like their landlords, making those landlords even more powerful. So wouldn't it be better for everybody, they reasoned, meaning every white man, wouldn't it be better if every white man owned their land outright? And that's how we get the American dream, a slice of English pastoral life in the scare quotes new world. The difference between an Englishman and a white American man is that a white American man is not beholden to any lord. He is beholden only to himself, in theory, if he doesn't mind being complicit in a genocide or two. So yeah, in the late 19th and up through the early 20th century, we got the Homestead Acts. Settlers moved out west in mass and built their own homes on dirt cheap land, and meanwhile more established American cities adopted streetcars. And that might sound quaint to modern ears, but it was actually a pretty huge deal. Streetcar routes radiated out in a star pattern from the center of the city, which meant that to gain regular, even daily access to the culture and resources of the city center, for the first time in history, you didn't have to actually live there. So we were already drinking the uniquely American cocktail of manifest destiny and car-oriented city planning when Woodrow Wilson launched his Own Your Own Home campaign. This is from The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Terrified by the 1917 revolution, government officials came to believe that communism could be defeated in the United States by getting as many white Americans as possible to become homeowners, the idea being that those who owned property would be invested in the capitalist system. And this wasn't some secret conspiracy theory. All throughout the suburban boom of the early to mid 20th century, people understood what they were buying into. In the wake of the Watts riots in 1966, Thomas Pynchon wrote a piece for the New York Times called A Journey into the Mind of Watts, which is partly about the man, but it's also about what Pynchon calls the little man. And the man is exactly who you think he is. He's the one wearing the boot that's on your neck that the riot hopes to dislodge by an inch or two. The little man is the vassal of the man. The man is the little man's liege lord. Watts is a suburb of LA, and LA is unique and uniquely American in that it's a huge, sprawling city made up kind of mostly of suburbs, full of single-family homes. And the little man is a homeowner. The little man is more invested in ruling his tiny personal fiefdom than he is in the well-being of the community that surrounds it. And even if the little man isn't cruel in terms of his behavior, his financial, emotional, and identitarian investment in his property makes him more likely to encourage his neighbors to put aside their legitimate grievances. Thus, the little man serves the propertied class who serve the man, who above all serve private property. The little man appeasingly licks the very boot that the necessary violence of the riot seeks to cast off. I believe all that, and yet I own a single-family home in the suburbs of my small city, and I'm glad that I do. Before I bought this house, I was spending more money renting month to month, and I was in a more precarious position. If my landlord didn't want me living in my own home anymore, they had to give me notice, of course, but there was ultimately no choice there. Any improvements I made, if I was even allowed to make them, I knew ultimately wouldn't belong to me. I couldn't get a dog, I couldn't plant a garden, I couldn't even paint a wall without asking for permission. And I was beholden to my landlord's petty whims, which vacillated between extremes of disinterest to the point of neglect on one end and unlawful surveillance on the other. I wanted real privacy. I wanted a home that was truly mine, And that desire, which is as old as humanity, has, like everything else, been captured by capitalism. When I say American suburban homeowner, I feel like for most of you, or at least those of you who are American yourselves, that conjures a specific image in your mind's eye. What I picture is a middle-aged white man wearing a cable knit sweater and drinking from a rocks glass, sitting in his home office, backed by a case full of leather-bound books he never reads, and he's got a smoking hot wife. And your vision might be less waspy. You might picture more of a Kevin James figure, a white man bedecked in the aesthetics of the working class, but who still owns his own clean, artfully modest single-family home. He's also got a smoking hot wife. According to the logic of the hyper-reality of these late 20th century sitcoms, these guys sit on opposite ends of a spectrum. But here, in actual reality, we understand that this is really just one type of guy.
This is your man.
Yes.
Look at the screen.
And like, who is he? Where did he even come from? Norman Rockwell was a prolific American commercial illustrator. He got his first paying art job at 18 years old in 1912, and he worked steadily until he developed dementia in 1972, and even after that, he still worked intermittently until his death in 1978 at the age of 84. That's a huge chunk of the 20th century, and during those several decades, he produced over 4,000 original works. There is something quintessentially American about that to me. Not just Rockwell's artwork itself, but the pace and tenor and trajectory of his career. The body of work that made him an American icon was his 321 original covers for the Saturday Evening Post, which he completed over the course of his 47-year tenure there. Even in 2026, I feel pretty confident assuming that virtually every American adult has seen one of these covers, or if you somehow haven't, you've seen The Four Freedoms, or if you haven't seen that, you've seen a vintage Coke ad, or an old Christmas card of Rockwell's. It's an American rite of passage to be exposed to a Norman Rockwell piece at some point in your life, whether you like it or not. I guess this is as good a time as any to admit that I don't like Rockwell's work very much. I actually kind of hate it most of the time, even though I think it's technically very good. It's kind of funny to imagine them inhabiting the same reality, let alone creating and reacting to art at the same time, but Rockwell and Vladimir Nabokov were actually contemporaries, and Nabokov, a famously tough and precise critic, accused Rockwell of putting his brilliant technique to banal use. I think a lot of people see Rockwell's work as overly sentimental and schmaltzy. I feel those things when I look at it, but I feel something else too, and please forgive me, it's a juvenile reaction, but I think emotional honesty is important when talking about art, so here it goes. This right here, this makes me cringe. And that is not a legitimate criticism on its own. It's a description of a reaction I'm having. But I do think digging into why I'm having that reaction might yield some fruitful results. So a lot of Rockwell's figures, these characters he's depicting, they're not really meant to be portraits. They're meant to represent certain ideas, certain concepts, usually in a flattering light. Propaganda, in other words, American propaganda. I think propaganda has its uses, but it rarely makes for interesting or enduring art outside of looking at it as a historical document, because propaganda is shallow by design. It doesn't really reward a close read, because it doesn't aim to provoke deeper thought, it aims to persuade. We can look at propaganda and think it's visually interesting, but the next time you look at a piece of propaganda whose message you agree with, honestly ask yourself, does it move you? Do you feel curious about it? Do you feel as though a human being is speaking directly to you through it? Do you feel as if that human is speaking to you as an equal? Because those are the qualities that make up the kinds of art that we continue to be moved by decades, centuries, even millennia later. Let's look at a painting by another iconic American artist, John Singer Sargent. And Sargent was European technically, but he was born to Boston Brahmin expats. He spent a lot of time in America, and he was extremely popular and sought after in America specifically during his lifetime. He even painted the official portrait of Teddy Roosevelt. What's more American than that? He painted a lot of other Americans too, including prominent New Yorkers, Mr. and Mrs. I.N. Phelps Stokes. It's hard to overstate how much I love this painting. It feels huge just to look at it on a screen, but it is also physically huge in reality. It's almost 7 feet tall. You can see it at the Met. The woman, Edith Minturn Stokes, appears not in a formal gown like you'd expect of a marriage portrait or even a typical Sargent painting. Rather, she's wearing a walking dress. She's flushed and vivacious. It's as if she's just blown into the room. It feels like she's the center of the universe, and her gaze invites you to look at her, to be in her orbit, but you also get the sense that she's sizing you up a bit, and her husband stands behind her like a bodyguard, signaling his unconditional endorsement. Probably a good time to mention that in Sargent's original plan for the painting, the husband was supposed to be a Great Dane. This was painted in 1897. Now, contrast that to this Rockwell piece that first appeared in the Saturday Evening Post in 1959, 62 years later. It's called Sunday Morning, and it's another American marriage portrait of sorts. It depicts a husband who's clearly been camped out in this Eames chair for a while, his papers spread across the floor, along with a half-drunk cup of coffee and an ashtray full of cigarette butts. He hasn't gotten dressed for the day. He's still in his robe. He's wearing this over-exaggerated, almost vaudevillian moue of faux guilt, and that's because his wife and kids are filing out behind him, dressed to the nines, presumably on their way to church without him. There are daffodils on the windowsill signaling spring, so this might even be an Easter service that they're going to, and Dad's clearly not coming with. There is a tension in the air, the sense of a stale argument that everyone in the house has already taken sides on. The chins of the wife and daughters are held loftily in the air, while the young son eyes his father with coy admiration. Congratulations, Dad, you've successfully instigated a gender war. We're supposed to see ourselves in the husband, of course. Of all the figures in the painting, he's the one who's facing us directly and with whom we're on the same level visually. We are his co-conspirators. Like in the Sargent painting, we have to look up to see the wife. Unlike the Sargent painting, which presents marriage as a united front, the Rockwell husband is looking up at his wife furtively. He feels bad that he's misbehaving, but not bad enough to actually do anything about it. That's the attitude of a child. And we, interlopers in his marriage, are being invited to empathize with his plight from a position of benevolent superiority. We've all weaseled out of something we didn't want to do, but we'd like to believe that we were a little more graceful about it than this guy. Norman Rockwell actually didn't watch a lot of TV, but people who made TV and movies certainly watched him, and he's codifying the dopey American sitcom dad here. Mr. and Mrs. Ian Phelps Stokes is a portrait of an American marriage, but Sunday Morning is a caricature of one, and it makes me cringe. It's embarrassing. There is a gulf, a gaping maw between what this piece assumes about me as its viewer and who I actually am. There's an American flavor to that set of assumptions. That's where I'm going with this, by the way. I'm arguing that Norman Rockwell's work was absolutely foundational in molding American cultural identity to creating our shared idea of what it means to be American. And I'm also observing that Norman Rockwell's work makes me cringe, and those things are related to each other. For this image to succeed, for most of Rockwell's work at the Post to hit, the viewer needs to accept that it reflects reality in some fundamental way, but I don't. I can't. And so the whole thing falls apart. It's a total airball. And as a viewer, I become the only party burdened by that knowledge. That is the essence of the cringe. Norman Rockwell tied a blindfold over his own eyes, confident he could shoot a free throw, but he missed by a mile. He still got the blindfold on, and he's looking at me, beaming, expecting me to congratulate him because he thinks he sunk the shot. What the fuck am I supposed to do now? And how did this become my problem? Print magazines were a core driver of American visual culture when Rockwell's popularity was at its zenith in the mid-20th century, and so not coincidentally, that's where he published his work. But print magazines are no longer driving American visual culture. So what is? Look in the mirror, baby. You know, it's us. Those amongst us whomst post. Memes are the Saturday Evening Post covers of today. And you may have noticed that the agitprop arm of the suicide cult, that is the US government, has itself become a bit of a purveyor of memes. The official DHS account posted this image in August of last year, but before we talk about it, I want to talk about the original artwork it's based on. It's not a Rockwell, although it looks a lot like one, and you'll occasionally see people erroneously claiming that it is. It specifically calls to mind Rockwell's Four Freedoms series, but it's actually by an artist named Frank Leah. It's called Which Way to Prosperity. I've also seen it called Uncle Sam at the Crossroads. So Frank Leah, not to be confused with the Irish cartoonist Frank Leah, was a much less famous contemporary of Norman Rockwell's. Really not that much is known about him today at all, but we can safely say he was influenced by Rockwell. By 1936, when this image first appeared on the cover of the Country Gentleman, Rockwell had already been working at the Saturday Evening Post for 20 years. So even though he hadn't reached the height of his popularity yet, any working American illustrator would have been familiar with his work. And looking back on it 90 years later, this image obviously belongs to the Rockwellian School of American Kitsch. Like, my source for this section is literally the Rockwell Center for American Visual Studies, so there you go. So what are we looking at here? Uncle Sam, personifying America, is standing alone at a dirt crossroads, surrounded by rolling hills and not much else. The only human-made object apart from his pack and the stars and stripes that make up his fit is a signpost. The sign pointing back the way he came reads Depression. In one direction ahead we have New Deal and inflation, in the other we have liberty and opportunity, and in his hand Uncle Sam holds a sign that's broken fully off the post. It's unclear which direction it was meant to be pointing, and that sign reads Prosperity. And Uncle Sam is wearing a befuddled expression because that just so happens to be his intention intended destination. So which way is he supposed to go from here? It's 1936. We're smack in the middle of the Great Depression. We know as a country where we want to end up. That's prosperity. But the problem is we don't know, or we can't all agree which direction to go to get there. We only know we can't go back. Back in August of last year, the Department of Homeland Security posted this version of Frank Leah's Which Way to Prosperity, edited and repurposed as an ICE recruitment ad. And, a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the Nazi shit. So that caption, written by a spokesperson of the United States government, Which Way, American Man, that is a Nazi dog whistle in the truest sense of the term. There's really no way to know if you're not already primed to hear it, but it's a quote from the 1978 book Which Way, Western Man by the influential neo-Nazi William Gailey Simpson, who in that same 700-page book argued, among other things, that Hitler was right. Groundbreaking stuff. But that phrase itself has been taken out of its original context and used as a sort of meme itself on the online far right. So why pair that caption with Uncle Sam at the Crossroads for the purposes of ICE recruitment? Well, it's not Uncle Sam at the Crossroads, exactly, not as Frank Leah intended it. It's been modified, memeified, you might say, and the changes that have been made to it are actually pretty subtle. If you weren't already familiar with the original image, you probably wouldn't even pick up on them. I mean, the overlaid text reads, "America needs you to join ICE now." That's an obvious modification. But the specific typeface is designed to mimic the look of early to mid-century hand-painted signs. That signals to me an attempt to minimize the fact of it being a new addition. I'm not saying they're actively trying to hide the fact that it's an alteration, but I am saying they're trying to not draw extra attention to the fact that that phrase and that image did not originally belong together. But the most substantive change is even more subtly rendered, and it's to the words on the sign itself. In the DHS image, the signs point to cultural decline and invasion in one direction, homeland and opportunity in the other, service is the sign pointing backwards, the direction Uncle Sam came from, and the broken sign in his hands reads law and order. So yeah, maybe this goes without saying, but these changes render this image completely incoherent. It's a recruitment ad for one thing, so why would service be pointing the direction Uncle Sam already came from? That's the sign that read depression in the original image. We're not supposed to want to go back there. Cultural decline and invasion, the supposed bad, scary things, those signs are both pointing in the same direction, so it's pretty clear by the logic of the image that we should want to go the other way. Uncle Sam is still wearing his befuddled expression, but why? He's holding a sign that says law and order, and again, according to the logic of the image, like, it's actually pretty clear which direction he should go to find that. Whoever made this meme clearly didn't understand or care to understand the original piece, so it's a bit of an own goal, but also it doesn't fucking matter. This image is not meant to stand up to scrutiny. It's not meant to appeal to anyone who doesn't think truck nuts are hilarious. Usually with a meme, the meaning is in the alteration. We parse the meaning of a meme through the meaning of the image's original context and whatever additional context we or someone else has added to it. Both image and addition have meaning on their own, but combined, new meaning is created. And the viewer knows that's happening. Their awareness is the point. In fine art, and drawing and painting specifically, when you see marks from a previous iteration of the piece that have been intentionally left in the final version, those are called pentimenti. They're not meant to represent literal photographic reality, but they are meant to add depth, movement, and context. And memes very often have pentimenti. They have visual evidence they've been altered from their original state. Their creators intentionally leaving visible underlayers behind. Pentimenti and memes often add both context and humor, and also interesting visual texture. The doctoring of the image is meant to be immediately obvious, and the fact of that doctoring creates new layers of meaning and intent. But this image that the DHS posted doesn't have pentimenti. If it did, it might look something like this, but it doesn't. If it looked like this, it'd be a lot more obvious that it doesn't make any fucking sense. Instead, the ways this image differs from the original Frank Leah piece have been intentionally obscured. There's no pentimenti because there's no context to draw attention to. In fact, the more you know about the original image, the less the new image makes sense. This image isn't saying anything because there's nothing to say. I've been asking in this video, like, how did we create this cultural identity of American suburban homeowner from whole cloth? But it's been a trick question all along. Surprise! This is white people shit, and white identity is not created, it is acquired. And the trick of whiteness is the active obfuscation of that fact. White American suburban homeowner is not a meaningful classifier, it is an absence, it's a void. White culture steals from other cultures in an attempt to plaster over its own vacuousness. We white people made a bad bargain when we bought into whiteness as an identity marker. It's made us lonely, it's made us angry, and it's damaged our ability to connect with art and culture because whiteness demands sacrifice of all other cultural ties at its altar. Whiteness cannot create, it can only steal. Norman Rockwell experienced the height of his popularity in the 50s. He died in 1978, but his work experienced a posthumous resurgence in popularity in the 1980s by way of Hollywood homage, which makes a lot of sense. The filmmakers of the 80s had grown up in the 50s, and now they were making period pieces about the era of their childhoods. But it wasn't just period pieces. Even in contemporary movies and TV, there was a renewed focus on suburban family life, moving away from the more densely urban settings of the most iconic films and TV of the 70s, into the single-family homes of Anytown, USA. This was in part a pendulum swing away from the grit and violence and cynicism of the movies and TV that defined the 70s, but it was also a reflection of a broader conservative moment, one that placed a reactionary focus on scare quotes family values amidst the AIDS epidemic. Like, it's not a coincidence that there were wholesome middle-class nuclear families on every screen, big and small, in this era when the people most likely to contract or be impacted by AIDS were urban-dwelling queer people, often people of color, who'd been forced to remove themselves or been forcibly removed from their families of origin. In the 80s, Americans became really afraid of queer people and really afraid of cities, and those fears are connected. And thus, in pop culture, we see this retreat, a flight, if you will, to white suburban enclaves, and this became the setting of some of the most iconic movies of the 80s. And that's where we see this nostalgia for Rockwellian aesthetics. Warm, artfully cluttered moments of greeting card domesticity featuring lots and lots of white people. And what I really don't want you to take away from this is that the family films of the 80s were secretly evil this whole time. Art is not an ARG that you can win. There is no all-seeing God author. Artists make art to figure out what they're trying to say, and if they do it right, their art is smarter than them about it. But there is no morally correct answer to uncover at the bottom of this. I think the great films of the 70s, Apocalypse Now, Taxi Driver, The Godfather, are some of the great films, period. These are movies responding to global societal shifts, and when contrasted with them, a lot of the defining movies of the 80s read as a sort of plugging of the ears. I don't think that art that prioritizes the personal over the political is always inherently conservative, but in an era of deregulation and union busting, in an era of backlash against the civil rights won in the 60s and 70s, in an era where silence equaled death, talk about a pendulum swing. In the 70s, we had All in the Family.
It's been a great experience living on this street and watching this wonderful family of Edith, Gloria, and Mike. I want to thank you, Bunker, for letting me know and letting me see that some white folks are better than other white folks.
And then premiering in 1987, near the height of the AIDS crisis in the US, we had a sitcom set in San Francisco where three guys raised a family together, and they weren't even gay. But at the same time, the suburban teen movies of the 80s mean a lot more to me personally than the big important movies of the 70s, and not because I'm some kind of stealth Reaganite, despite what my outfit might suggest. I just grew up in the 90s and aughts in the middle of white suburban nowhere, watching movies like The Breakfast Club on syndicated cable, and I recognized myself in those characters who felt hemmed in by their surroundings and misunderstood by both parents and peers, whose problems the text took seriously despite their youth. John Hughes wrote and directed The Breakfast Club, and John Hughes is a serial Norman Rockwell referencer. There are some shots in his movies that are direct homages to specific Rockwell works, but even when he's not directly referencing him, there is a certain sensibility that belongs in the same lineage of Americana. Like at the end of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Ferris and Sloane do a sort of end-of-date ritual, emulating a more mature relationship, which is a recurring motif of Rockwell's. Before Ferris takes off at a sprint, harmlessly cutting through his neighbor's yard so he can sneak back into his own house where he was supposed to have been homesick this whole time. When I say John Hughes movies are Rockwellian, that is the wholesomely mischievous, hyper-real quality I'm referring to. My favorite movie of this oeuvre isn't actually a John Hughes movie at all, although it was certainly influenced by and in conversation with Hughes' work. It came out in 1989. It's called Say Anything, written and directed by Cameron Crowe. Everybody remembers this movie as the one where John Cusack hoists a boombox over his head wearing an absolutely iconic fit. But there's actually a lot of other stuff going on in this movie too, a lot of very American stuff. Nominally, the movie takes place in the suburbs of Seattle, but it was shot in LA, so the result is very any suburb USA. The movie's central romance is what people remember, and it's melodramatic and over the top in the way love is when you're a teenager. And the heightened drama of the romance highlights how the surrounding story and setting are more subtle and complicated and adult than we usually expect from teen movies. The movie begins with high school graduation and is set in the summer after, capturing the liminal space between adolescence and adulthood. These characters are still teenagers technically, but they're now expected to navigate the adult world. Diane lives a comfortable comfortable, if overprotected, upper middle class life with her single dad. And they have an unusually close relationship, and part of the reason for that, which becomes clear as the movie progresses, is Diane has never meaningfully challenged her dad. She's always done what she was supposed to do because what she wanted or thought she wanted coincided with what her dad wanted for her also, until now. And that's the real story of the movie, and the romance is the vehicle for it. The first thing Diane ever does that causes her dad to raise his eyebrows is agree to go on a date with Lloyd Dobler. Now, why is that? And if you haven't seen the movie, if you've only seen the image of John Cusack as Lloyd hoisting the boombox wearing a trench coat, you might assume he's some kind of proto-incel loser, but he's demonstrably not. Lloyd is not only popular in the true sense of the word, in the sense that he is incredibly well-liked by his peers, but he's primarily popular with girls who adore him not because they're swooning over him, but because he's a good person who treats people well.
Hey, I know this is a strange thing to say, but maybe Diane Court really likes Lloyd.
If you were Diane Court, would you honestly fall for Lloyd?
Yeah.
Lloyd is liked by virtually everyone he encounters, and for good reason. After rewatching both movies as an adult, I can confidently say that Lloyd Dobler has the riz that Ferris Bueller thinks he has. So why doesn't Diane's dad like this guy? Surprise! Everything's been about class this whole time. Pick any piece of English media, not English as in the English language, but English as in originating from the place where people put beans on toast. But honestly, not just there. That's what I'm most familiar with, because I mostly engage with Anglophone media. But in art from all over the world outside of America, you'll see ideas about social class expressed overtly. In Downton Abbey, how many times am I going to mention this royalist propaganda show in this video about American culture? Just twice. This is the last time. But in Downton Abbey, one of the English earl's daughters marries the Irish chauffeur, and that's a big scandal because she's a lady and he's not a gentleman. He's not even an Englishman. And the fact that that's a problem is expressed not as subtext, but as text. The match between them is socially unacceptable because of class difference, and that's spoken out loud as fact. Sybil is the daughter of an English earl, Tom is a working-class Irish Republican, and the known and accepted consequence of their marriage is Sybil's social death. Those are the observable facts on the ground, and in England circa 1918, no one was considered rude for speaking them plainly. American class conversations, on the other hand, must be covert, and resultingly, we don't really have a precise or sophisticated vocabulary for class difference as it manifests in the US, but that certainly doesn't mean that class difference doesn't exist here. He's from the wrong side of the tracks is a euphemism because it's rude to say what you really mean, which is that guy's poor. Or, more specifically, that guy lives in an area associated with violent degeneracy, a scare quotes, bad neighborhood. And in turn, bad neighborhood is a white American euphemism for place where black people live. In The Breakfast Club, we're meant to understand that one of the teens in detention, John Bender, is from the wrong side of the tracks. But what that actually means, how that has materially impacted his access to opportunity in the past and will continue to impact him in the future, is left mostly up to our imagination, partly due to the setting and constraints of the movie. It takes place over a single day in detention in the library of a public high school in suburban Illinois. And over the course of the day, these 5 high schoolers who each belong to different social strata gradually open up. They find the empathy and understanding with each other that they haven't been able to find with their respective cliques. And like most great stories, the characters leave it forever changed. They forge a connection with each other, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. And the thing that makes Bender different from his peers is his class status. But The Breakfast Club is not a class-conscious film, and Bender's class, or more specifically, the chip he has on his shoulder because of it, is treated as an obstacle he needs to personally overcome in order to achieve personal growth. In the context of the movie, class is an affectation, not unlike being a nerd or a jock. The trappings of class and any lingering associated resentment are teenage affectations you should grow out of, or at least learn to see in less stratified terms as you mature. That's the point of the movie, if I may be so crass. The Breakfast Club is about the American dream. It argues that the gauntlet of American adolescence is ultimately equalizing if you have grit, determination, and an open heart. These characters have passed the test set not by whatever insipid individual authority figure, but by society at large, and going forward they will be true and equal peers. Will they though? After the credits roll, will Bender have access to the same opportunities as Claire? So why doesn't Diane's dad like Lloyd? Well, Lloyd is from the wrong side of the tracks. But that can be kind of easy to miss because unlike Bender, Lloyd doesn't wear his grievances on his sleeve. When I was a teenager watching Say Anything, I thought Lloyd was so cool because he's this senior in high school who lives with his older sister while his parents are in a different country. They're stationed in Germany with the army. But watching it in my 30s, I realize now that Lloyd was functionally abandoned. He's been helping his sister, who's a single mom, raise her very young son, and because she's got her own stuff going on, she often expects Lloyd to act like a father to his nephew. Lloyd's been parentified. Diane and the rest of their graduating class begin the movie by just now entering the liminal space between adolescence and adulthood, but it's clear that Lloyd's already been living there for a while. Why doesn't Diane's dad like Lloyd? Well, Diane's dad, Jim, he's cosplaying a sitcom dad, but Lloyd will only play the sitcom boyfriend role up to a point. He's kind, he's respectful, he never mocks Jim or raises his voice like Bender would, but because of the circumstances of his upbringing, Lloyd is not the one thing Jim needs him to be, which is naively deferential to authority figures. Lloyd has a much clearer picture of the real world than Diane does. He never holds Diane's inexperience against her or her father, but he's also unwilling to traffic in polite lies about his own future, because he knows arguably even better than the adults in the room how the world works, or at least he's more willing to be honest about it.
I don't want to sell anything, buy anything, or process anything as a career. I don't want to sell anything bought or processed, or buy anything sold or processed. My father's in the Army. He wants me to join, but I can't work for that corporation. So what I've been doing lately is kickboxing.
Jim doesn't like Lloyd because Lloyd poses a threat to the kayfabe holding Diane's family together, because Jim has a big secret. Jim owns a retirement home, and it turns out he's under criminal investigation for stealing money, a lot of money, from residents who've passed away under his care. To cover his tracks, he's been using most of the money on cash purchases, lavishly feathering his suburban nest and buying expensive gifts for Diane. Diane didn't know any of this, and when she finally finds out, it destroys not only her relationship with her father, but also her entire worldview. Everything she used to know about her place in the world was a lie.
Diane, I take better care of those people than their families do. I care for them. I give them flowers. I feed them. I wipe their mouths.
No, but you stole from them!
I make their lives better.
She's always cared about Lloyd, but up until she learns the truth about her father, her relationship with Lloyd had been unequal. And Diane never would have said it out loud, but she thought she was better than Lloyd in some fundamental way. And her coming-of-age moment is learning that she's not. Her father instilled in her this idea that some people are just better than other people, but it was all this massive lie. Diane's advantages, her material possessions, her entire life was only possible because it was stolen from someone else. And she didn't know that before, but she knows it now. So what is she gonna do about it? Oh, hello there. Allow me to briefly interrupt myself, not to do a mid-roll ad for some boutique subscription toothpaste or whatever, but to let you know that this video is actually sponsored by viewers like you. If you didn't know, I have a Patreon that you can subscribe to for $3 a month. Many already do. You'll see their names at the end of this video. I literally would not have been able to make this without their support. Perks include an ad-free version of the video you're watching now and one bonus video per month. And that's stuff that'll never see the light of YouTube. If you're enjoying this video so far and you like cultural criticism, media analysis, book drama, and discourse du jour, and or the hockey romance show, not the straight one, the good one, then I think there's a really good chance you'll like what I do over on Patreon. And it's only $3 a month because it's important for me to keep my work as accessible as possible, but because math, that means I need more people. The reason it takes me a long time to make these public-facing videos is because I do all the writing and producing and editing myself. I also have a full-time day job. My goal is to not just do this full-time, but to be able to be totally community funded while I do it. I'm not sure how feasible that is, to be totally candid with you, and this isn't me promising to never get a sponsor. I might have to at some point, but I really don't want to, because frankly I don't like most companies, and I really want to avoid putting a company in a situation where they can influence what I do or say on here. So if you like my work and that resonates with you at all, please consider supporting me on Patreon for $3 a month. For that, you'll get a monthly bonus video and an ad-free version of this and future YouTube videos, and also your name in the credits. But forget about me for a second. If you don't want to join the Patreon today, that's totally fine. But think about another creator you like. If you want to watch or read or listen to original work that's carefully crafted, that doesn't shill, that's not slop, we're in an age where you gotta support the people creating it directly. If not me, then another creator whose work is meaningful to you. That's it. That's my spiel. Thank you so much for your time. Back to you, Mel. The suburbs are as old as civilization, we know that now, but American suburbs as we think of them today, cul-de-sacs lined with single-family homes owned by working-class families, those are an invention of the mid-20th century. Before that, mortgages were a lot harder to secure and a lot harder to pay off once you did. You needed a down payment of up to 50%, and you had to pay back your loan in interest-only payments over a period of 5 to 7 years. That's not something most working people could do. Then the Great Depression happened, and literally nobody could do it. Nobody could afford to buy a home, and the people who had already bought homes were defaulting on their loans left and right. Enter in 1935 the Federal Housing Administration, which was a total game changer because they offered insurance to lenders, and when loaning money became less risky for banks, banks were able to provide more flexible loans, and that's how we get the thing that made homeownership a realistic middle-class goal. The thing that put that promised American pastoral slice of life within reach of working people for the very first time. The miracle that is the amortized mortgage. Wait, focus back. This is actually really important. Imagine having to take out a personal loan to buy a house. That's what we're talking about pre-FHA. Very short terms, interest-only payments. And if you defaulted and your home was repossessed, that money's just gone now. So no wonder most Americans were renters. But with an amortized mortgage, not only are down payments lower, not only can you pay over the course of 15 to 30 years instead of 5 to 7, but crucially, with each payment, you are paying down both the interest and the principal. You are building equity. In America, this is how wealth can be created by working people and passed down from generation to generation, as long as you're white. Because that's the catch. Amortized mortgages were only widely accessible through FHA-insured loans, and for decades, the FHA routinely refused to insure home loans issued to Black people. And that might sound like I'm exaggerating because there's this prevailing American cultural myth of de facto housing segregation. Like, we have this idea that Black people live in Black neighborhoods because it just kind of worked out that way. No, actually, Black Americans were systematically excluded from suburban home ownership on purpose from the top down via interlocking methods at various points enshrined in law. And one of those methods was, of course, redlining. The FHA wouldn't insure a home loan deemed risky, and homes were considered risky if they were in Black neighborhoods, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because Black homebuyers didn't have access to the more affordable FHA loans that their white counterparts did, they had to take out more aggressive predatory loans, which ate up more money that they had to work more to earn, and that was time and money that couldn't be invested back into their property, which ensured the deteriorating conditions associated with risky lending. And to access FHA loans, it's not like Black families could just buy homes in less risky, white neighborhoods because of restrictive racist covenants that predate the FHA. In white neighborhoods, there'd be a clause in your deed that said you couldn't sell your home to a non-white person. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that the government wouldn't enforce those covenants, but people put them in anyway. Before building, subdivision developers spun up homeowners associations and made membership in the associations a condition of initial purchase. And one of the association bylaws would inevitably be that you can't sell your house to a non-white person. In the 20th century, homeownership became the main route for working families to build generational wealth. And that opportunity was stolen from Black people wholesale. And this isn't one of those things we look back on now and realize how brutally unfair it was. No, people knew it was wrong then, too. So we're here in the suburbs of Southwest Louisville, lively shively as we locals call it. This neighborhood's a lot more diverse now than it used to be, which isn't saying much because it used to be all white. The Wade family were the pioneers on that front. And this is the neighborhood that Andrew Wade, his pregnant wife Charlotte, and their 2-year-old daughter Rosemary moved to in 1954. They didn't actually buy their home themselves though, because no real estate agent would sell it to them, which was illegal, but you know, they did it anyway. So the Wades enlisted the help of their acquaintances, prominent progressive white activists Karal and Ann Braden, who bought the house themselves and handed the deed over to the Wades. And the racist terror campaign began immediately. Literally the night the Wades moved in, their neighbors fired a gun at their house and burned a cross outside. And the violence continued, both overtly, like their neighbors throwing rocks through their windows, and covertly, like the milkman and the newspaper boy refusing to deliver to their house. Eventually things came to a head when their neighbors placed a bomb directly under 2-year-old Rosemary's room and literally blew up the house. Small mercy, no one was home at the time, but the house was basically destroyed. No charges were ever brought brought on any of the Wade's neighbors. That's why I don't even know their names. But do you know who was charged? Carl and Ann Braden, the white couple who bought the house. You truly can't make this shit up. This is reporting directly from Louisville's NPR affiliate. Ann and Carl Braden and their 5 white associates were charged with sedition, accused of hatching a communist plot to buy the home, blow it up, touch off a race war, and overthrow the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Carl Braden was ultimately convicted of sedition and served 8 months in prison for, to remind you, buying a black family a house, which, according to the letter of the law, they should have been allowed to do regardless. If that sounds like insanity, it is, but it's also worth understanding that these events unfolded atop a powder keg of festering white supremacist resentment. This was 1954, and the Supreme Court had ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional in the Brown versus Board of Education decision on May 17th. Neighbors blew up the Wade's house on June 27th. By the early 1960s, the Saturday Evening Post was losing relevancy. In an attempt to reclaim their crown as the arbiter of American culture, they hired a new CEO who was more interested in a sort of LA by way of Route 66 aesthetic than Rockwell's Main Street America. By this point, Rockwell's signature style was already seen as stale, kitschy, and outmoded, even by his own employer. There was something else brewing, too. For years, the Post had enforced a policy banning the depiction of black people in anything other than menial service roles, and that was starting to bother Rockwell. Should it have bothered him decades before? Yeah, but better late than never, I guess. Norman Rockwell left the Post in 1961, and although he'd passively deferred to the Post's racist policy for decades, clearly it was legitimately weighing on his heart by this point, because he did a face turn. He moved to Look magazine, and his first cover for them, which was his idea that he pitched, ended up being the best work of his entire career, and a defining image of the American Civil Rights Movement. If you're American, I guarantee you've seen it. It's an oil painting. It's called The Problem We All Live With, and it first appeared on the cover of Look magazine in January 1964. Following the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, a U.S. Circuit judge ordered desegregation to begin in New Orleans on November 14th, 1960, which is the day then 6-year-old Ruby Bridges enrolled in the all-white William Frantz Elementary School. Threats of violence were so intense that she was escorted by 4 U.S. Marshals, and that event is the subject of Rockwell's painting. The image became so famous, so iconic, that many people mistakenly believe it's based on a real photograph of the event. It's not. The composition is entirely Rockwell's design. His neighbor, then 7-year-old Linda Gunn, stood in as the model for the Ruby Bridges figure. This is the best painting Rockwell ever made. Technically, it's outstanding, but all of Rockwell's work is technically good. What makes this painting outstanding is that with it, he finally leaves the realm of anodyne greeting card schlock and achieves the Frank Capra quality he's been reaching for and falling short of for decades. Unlike most of his previous work, this painting has depth, it has honesty. The triumph in it is underscored by notes of hateful ugliness. It's so effective not only because it depicts the Ruby Bridges figure as brave, as graceful, as dignified, but from her school supplies to the bows in her hair to her stature so small she doesn't even come up to the elbows of the men around her. It takes pains to depict her as one little girl, an American girl. In 1959's Sunday Morning, and in a lot of Rockwell's work, the viewer takes on the role of co-conspirator. So with whom are we, the viewers, conspiring in The Problem We All Live With? Well, whose point of view are we in? There's a reason Ruby Bridges needed escorts. The real-life Ruby Bridges later recalled that when they pulled up to the school that day, the mob of angry white people hurling rocks and shouting death threats was so big that at first she mistakenly thought it was Mardi Gras. That crowd isn't depicted in this painting, but that doesn't mean it isn't present in it. We see evidence of its presence in the remnants of the thrown tomato and the slur scrawled on the wall. Ruby Bridges was surrounded by a mob of angry white people who aren't depicted in this image because the image is painted from their point of view. If Rockwell's MO was to reflect white American people back to themselves for the first time in his career, he's actually achieved it with a degree of honesty. Here we are. Take a good hard look. The American suburbs were maybe the greatest, longest-running pump-and-dump scheme of all time. How we've been taught both through mass media and state programs with their associated propaganda, going all the way back to the Founding Fathers, to think of home ownership as an inherent virtue. That belief enabled the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. It precipitated an environment where people thought owning a home was always the best decision, even if it didn't make financial sense for them, which made a lot of people ripe to be taken advantage of by predatory lenders, which is exactly what happened. In the years leading up to the crisis in a practice known as reverse redlining. Lenders targeted poor and working families, disproportionately black, with increasingly predatory mortgages. Mortgages that required very low or even no down payments and low introductory teaser interest rates, followed by a huge interest spike after a couple of years. The pitch was you'd then refinance with the equity you built during that teaser interest rate period before the big interest spike hit. The problem was, what equity? The pitch was predicated on the belief that these homes would infinitely appreciate in value. But all of a sudden it's 2008 and a lot of people's homes were worth less than they were when they bought them. So those families had no equity and no recourse when they hit that interest spike, which they inevitably couldn't pay. That's how 10 million Americans lost their homes in the crisis. And those were mostly suburban single-family homes. The suburbs, the way we've conceived of them for decades as isolated enclaves for rich white people, that was all an aberration. Throughout all of history, wealthy elites have always lived closer to city centers, and now in the years following the housing crisis in America, we're finally seeing a return to that tradition. This is known as the Great Inversion. People who can afford to are moving to the city proper to take advantage of urban infrastructure, and the urban poor, suddenly priced out of their own neighborhoods, are being pushed out to the suburbs because they can't afford to live in the city anymore. The dream of the American suburbs as an ideal way of life is dead. It died in 2008. But the physical reality of American suburbs are still here all around us, and the majority of Americans are living out their lives in their desiccated husks for lack of better options. I'm describing my own life, by the way. I live in the suburbs of Louisville, which is a very affordable city compared to the rest of the cities in the country. And I lived in the city proper as a renter throughout my 20s, but when I decided to buy a house here, I couldn't afford anything in the old neighborhoods I used to rent in, so I bought a house out here instead, surrounded by concrete and car dealerships. So right now I'm parked about a 5-minute drive from my house, drinking coffee in an abandoned parking lot. Believe it or not, this is a much more pleasant sensory experience than sitting at the two-top outside the strip mall Starbucks inhaling dumpster fumes. I've been on a bit of an exercise journey this year. I'm working up to 10,000 steps today, and the hardest part has been not the physical activity itself, but figuring out how to fit it into my day. If I lived in a densely populated urban neighborhood, I could knock out 10,000 steps just by doing errands, but I can't safely walk to do errands in my neighborhood because I live in the suburbs and everything's designed for cars here. There are no sidewalks. If I just want to walk around, I have to drive somewhere to do it first. But it's not just a lack of walkability. Huge swaths of suburban space aren't really designed to interact with human bodies at all. In his book Hinterland, geographer Phil A. Neel describes these spaces as being designed for cars and capital. It's almost like there's this suburban social contract we all signed, like we agree to stay in our homes 95% of the time, and then for that other 5%, we go to Meijer or we go to the new K-Pot that just opened up, and we all sort of agree to ignore these desolate, useless deserts of concrete that separate points A and B. I'm talking about true liminal spaces. There are plenty of people who have observed this already and have actual ideas about how to fix it. I'm not an urban planner. I'm here to talk about art. And some of my favorite contemporary art seeks to capture this liminality. That's what the North American liminal space images are about. To me, that's why they feel uncanny. They're looking directly at the thing we're all supposed to ignore. This art is important because it exposes the malfunctioning pieces of a broken whole. Well-designed systems are invisible. It's only when systems start to fall apart that we can see evidence of their faulty engineering. When confronted with that evidence, when art confronts us with that evidence, we have some options. We could pretend we don't see it. We could pretend it's still working for us. We could ignore it, put blinders on, hop in the SUV, drive to Target, or we could walk right up to it and look it in the eye.